This week's film feature is a vision of the world at more or less exactly the same time as Lionel Shriver's novel. The Mandibles opens in 2029. This movie is set in the year 2026. 90 years ago this week, January 10th, 1927, the most expensive film ever made in Germany opened in Berlin. Fritz Lang's Metropolis cost 5 million Reichsmarks, which made it the Avatar or Star Wars of its day. I wouldn't want to overextend that comparison, but the visual style of Metropolis has continued through to Star Wars and The Matrix and virtually every other sci-fi dystopia that features vast man-made cityscapes from which nature has been entirely expunged. Metropolis is set in a city called Metropolis. This is a decade before the creators of Superman made it the hometown of the Daily Planet and Clark Kent. And this Metropolis is far more consciously generic, I'd say. Fritz Lang and his wife and co-author set the story 100 years in the future, or in other words, round about now, when, as they saw it, the elite would rule from penthouses far above us, while everyone else would toil all day underground, operating the huge machines needed to power the big city. Nothing dates quicker than futuristic visions, but Metropolis has endured to influence succeeding generations of filmmakers. And to talk about the movie, I'm joined by Tom Gunning from the University of Chicago. He's the author of the Films of Fritz Lang, Allegories of Vision and Modernity, published by our old friends at the British Film Institute. Tom, great to have you with us. Why is Metropolis still important today?
It's a little bit of a mystery because it has gone up and down in critical estimation, but it's always been fascinating to audiences. And I think it's because it's so varied. It has so many different elements. It's got religiosity, it's got politics, it's got sci-fi thrills, it's got amazing architecture, it's got state-of-the-art special effects, circa 1926. And almost everybody, there's something they don't like in the film, but there are things they do like. And even though a lot of critics, when it came out, like H.G. Wells, who pronounced it the silliest film he'd ever seen.
That's right.
Excoriated it for one reason or another, usually dealing with the plot and the characters. It survived because it has so much going for it, so many interesting kind of details of conception and primarily, I would say, and it's my own critical bias perhaps, because visually it's a masterpiece.
Right.
You know, it might be that the plot could be picked apart, but again and again, even the more ridiculous parts of the plot are visualized in an extraordinary manner.
No, the composition and the visual style of the film is amazing. You mentioned that famous negative review by H.G. Wells. When we look at Wells's predictive fiction, if you look at The Time Machine, people still use Eloy and Morlocks today as a metaphor for a soft, pampered elite and great snarling underclass. How does it work with Lang's futuristic vision? What did he get right? What did he get wrong?
Well, it's a curious thing because was he really trying to predict the future, or was he trying to talk about his own age? That it takes place in 2026 is not only saying, oh, it's 100 years in advance, but saying it's like today in the message is relevant to today. Wells had influenced the film. I think that's partly why he was kind of miffed by it. He could see things taken from Time Machine and from his novella, When the Sleeper Awakes. There are many details that Lang and his wife, Thea von Harbaugh, the scriptwriter, had taken from that. But for instance, and it was largely that he thought it was a very bad prediction of the future. But if you look at part of his objection, he said, well, we all know that in the future nobody will live in cities. You know, I mean, come on. But that was, you know, he had some basis for it, censors, Censuses had indicated people were moving out of cities into the countries, into the suburbs. And of course, to some extent, it's been true, but of course, it's been an ebb and flow. So predicting the future is always, as you say, something that dates very quickly. And actually, I don't think it's primarily what the film was about. It's really about the tensions in a modern world where machines and people have to interrelate. And that, I think, is still very relevant, not in the sense of being accurate, but in the sense of being insightful.
Yes, because this kind of fiction at this time, man's relationship to the machine is that he's kind of literally shackled to it, to operate it. And as you say, that is still relevant, but we have friendlier machines now. They fit inside our pockets, they seem friendly, they play our favorite songs, but in a sense, it's still a kind of dependency on the machine.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not only a dependency, it's a kind of overwhelming. Yeah. We can't get away from them. Yeah. It always amused me when computers were being introduced and they said, now you can work at home. Oh, how wonderful. Right. And I wanted to say, yes, now you no longer have a home. Yeah. Your home has become your factory.
Right.
And to some extent, that even though it's not, he certainly didn't predict computers and any of those elements, but that sense that somehow there's going to be a gulf between the technology and the technocrats who rule the society and the people who are kind of become, in effect, servants to the machine, I think that's still an issue.
Yeah, and what about, which I think is an issue for our time, both in the sense that a large part of the political establishment of left and right now takes it as normal, which is the idea of a surveillance state, a controlled society. Not as crude as in Lang's vision, but that's the idea that the state keeps tabs on you and always knows where you are. That's present in Metropolis too.
Absolutely. I mean, one way technologically, one of the very first cinematic presentations of the idea of television occurs. Yeah. Somewhat briefly, a kind of visual telephone between the foreman of the workers and the master in his faraway skyscraper-topped office. Right. That they communicate through a kind of telephone that is also a kind of television screen. Right. So there's that type of thing that he's already thinking about that. Yeah. But even more, there's this sense, and it's in almost all of Lang's films, particularly in his first sound film, M, right. The sense that the society has to keep track of people. Yeah. That there's always a process of information as well as surveillance of just getting the paper trace of everybody. And the way that there are spies in Metropolis who follow the movements of the main characters and report back to the master of Metropolis.
Yeah.
This is an important aspect. And something which, again, actually that's not something Wells ever dealt with.
No, and as I said, it's something very relevant to our time, where the government uses barcodes on state ID to track your movements here and there, so that if something happens in Germany, the guy had previously been in France and then in Austria and all that. So that's part of our time, but it's also, of course, in a sense, he was predicting what would happen to his own country. Absolutely. Just 5 or 6, 7 years after this movie.
For sure. I mean, one of the most fascinating things about Metropolis is the way that it reflects, as I say, the time in which it was made, which is towards the end of the Weimar period, this period after World War I, where Germany was trying to have a democratic and not exactly getting its act together. And the economics were in turmoil. And the Nazi Party and the Communist Party were having street battles every day, violent altercations. And all of this was something that Lang and his scriptwriter wife were really aware of, and in fact had rather different views of.
Well, that's the thing. You say, I like that phrase you used, they were rather aware of, because Mr. and Mrs. Came to different conclusions about where Germany was headed.
Absolutely. I mean, more a few years later, because of course the Nazi Party is still rather small. It's making a lot of news, but it's not large in population yet. But by the 30s, of course, it's very clear, where that Hitler is going to be a major force in the country. Lang becomes an anti-Nazi, and his wife, von Harbo, who had been his collaborator and his soulmate for decades, became a Nazi. And they split. And in fact, I, as a young man, was privileged to spend some time with Lang. And I was in my 20s, kind of naive, and I said to him at one point, "What do you think about the role of love in your films?" And he went, "Yeah, love. I ask you, if a man is a communist and his wife is a Nazi, where does love go?" So I don't know that he was a communist, although I know he was a leftist. But they did split. She stayed, became a filmmaker under Hitler. He went to Hollywood.
Well, we heard stories a few weeks ago, problems in American mixed marriages where you've got a Republican and a Democrat after November the 8th. But this takes it to a whole other level, the Nazi, anti-Nazi thing. It's like hard to keep that going across the breakfast table.
She survived the war, but they never met again.
No. You knew him. He was, because he eventually came to the United States, he had eyesight problems, and his first instinct was to wear a monocle. And in a sense, when you start talking about him like that, he kind of blurs into the Erich von Stroheim character in Sunset Boulevard. He's playing a German film director at a certain level. What was he actually like when you met him?
Well, it's very interesting because I only met him a few times, and of course I was just a kind of young fan, although he was very gracious to me. I've heard many stories that he could be very different from the Lang that I met, that he could be very brutal. But Lang, of course, late in his career in the 60s, played himself in a film by Jean-Luc Godard called Contempt, where he plays a German director working in Italy. And in that film, he is the most gracious and wonderful, wise old man. That's the Lang I met. And I met him a number of times, and he always had that kind of persona. And he was smart, and he was gracious, as I say, and funny. But I know other people who encountered a very different Lang. In fact, the last time I saw him in New York, he said, "Oh, come and visit me in California. Come to my house, please." And I never did. And at one point I really thought, God, I should have. But then I heard a story about a young woman who he'd met in a similar college tour who showed up at his house and he called the police. I think he had, I don't think I'd say mood swings in a psychological sense, but I think he had a range of personalities.
He must have been, which is a tragedy for a film director, but he was losing his eyesight, and he couldn't really direct anymore. And I guess he was, back then he was like wearing an eye patch?
Right. He had been in World War I, a pilot, and he'd had an injury to his eye. And so one of his eyes was weak, and it's partly why he had the monocle, even though I'm sure it was at least equally for its theatrical effect.
Right.
And he looks very good. I've never figured out how anybody keeps those things from falling out, but
No, it's hard on your eyebrows. That takes its toll after the first couple of decades, I should think.
For sure. Yeah. But there is a story that in the 50s, at one point he went in to have his eyes checked, and the optometrist said, "Please read the chart." And he said, "You have to turn on the light." And the optometrist said, "The light's on." But he could still see. I mean, and he went to movies still. He had to sit in the front row. And I'll tell you the truth, I think he probably could have directed blind better than most people could direct with sight.
That's an interesting point. I would guess if you polled most people, certainly in the English-speaking world, the most famous single Fritz Lang moment is probably the moment in The Big Heat when Gloria Graham gets a pot of hot coffee thrown in her face, and she's hideously burned. It's a magnificent performance by Gloria Graham and terrific film. But I was interested, what connects his Hollywood work with Metropolis? In other words, is there a kind of Lang Irv that coheres across the ocean?
I think there is, but what's interesting is that it's against a lot of differences, you know, and so it actually becomes almost, for the critic like myself, kind of detective work to see, okay, what makes this Hollywood film like The Big Heat, gangster film set in the big city in America, made in 1950s, to and a film of medium budget to the biggest, most expensive German film ever made, you know, the super production of the nation, you know, a big event. What holds those together? And they are very, very different. And it was an enormous step down for Lang to come to America, not so much because he wasn't respected, because he was respected, but just directors did not have the power in Hollywood that they did in Germany. In Germany, the director controlled performance, he overlooked editing, he was in charge of the camera. I mean, there was a cameraman and there was an editor, but he had control over these things. In Hollywood, not at all. The producer might. And Lang eventually became a producer for a couple of his films and had regained that control. But for the most part, he was an employee. So he had to figure out how to work more subtly, more like a termite than an elephant.
Right.
And the themes, you know, the theme of the big city in The Big Heat, it's not the futuristic city of Metropolis, but it is a city of deep corruption, of power, of surveillance. And it is a kind of nightmare city, and even though there aren't monsters, wandering around in special effects as there are in the silent film, partly because Lang realized that sound film was different from silent film, that it was more realistic in a way.
Well, let me ask you about that, because he did think at the time he made Metropolis that the world he was conjuring in that film of a surveillance state where people spied on each other, that in fact the great thing about silent film was it leapt beyond linguistic barriers, so that a Frenchman could watch his film and a Scotsman could watch his film, and if you were sitting in the jungles of Papua, you could watch that film. And so that was the power of film. It spoke to the planet. And while we discuss the power of his predictions in the movie, he certainly failed to see what was coming in his own art form, because a couple of months after this film opened, Al Jolson said, "You ain't seen nothing yet," and sang Mammy. Talking Pictures were here, and Metropolis and the silent film era belong to the dustbin of history.
Lang probably did have some intuition that this was coming. I mean, first off, he was very interested in sound, even in the silent era. The score for Metropolis, which has now been restored, is marvelous. Much better than, well, let alone the disco version that Giorgio Moroder did in the 80s.
You don't care for the disco Metropolis?
It's got a quality of the 80s.
Okay.
But what's so interesting, I always, just to digress for a moment, remember when he came out with it, he said, well, I love this film and I want to introduce it to a new generation. I want to make it live again. And it did for a few years, but when I showed it in the 90s, the audience, my students, weren't so much laughing at the acting. They were where it was silent acting. They were howling, though, at Adam Ant and Pat Benatar. That dated more quickly.
That's far more dated than anything from 1926.
But the score that now is on the Criterion restoration is the original German score. And I wouldn't say it's great music. I wouldn't want to listen to it in a concert. But it's very good film scoring. And Lang, he didn't, again, compose it, but he oversaw the composition. He approved it. So he was aware that sound was coming, and for the very next film that he made, his second science fiction film, The Woman in the Moon, He thought about doing it as a sound film. 1928 was possible. He didn't, but although I think there was a version with kind of sound effects. But the thing is, in 1930, when he makes his first sound film, M, he is the master of sound.
He,
you know, it's like it is a new thing for him, and he's interested in the novelty, but he's definitely not like a beginner. You know?
I wanted to finally, Tom, return to, I guess, this idea of visions of the past and how relevant they are to our time. Visions of the future and how relevant they are to our time. The most famous character in the film, in a way, is the one we all, when we think of the image of the film, the posters of the film, is the robot. And there's this interesting theme, I guess, which again seems kind of relevant to where we are today about the idea of artificial life versus humanity, and at what point humanity and artificial life merge. That was a relatively, again, that wasn't a topic that was, robots were a thing, but the intersection of robots and humanity, that's much more specific to Fritz Lang.
I absolutely agree. I mean, the term robot, of course, had come from RUR, the Czech play, which is just a few years before. But interestingly, the idea of a woman robot. The robots in RUR are workers, and that's part of what the idea is. But what's more immediate in Metropolis is the idea of making a woman, you know. And that actually comes, I'm fairly sure of this, from a novel written in France at the turn of the century called The Eve of the Future, which is a crazy novel by a symbolist poet, Villiers d'Isle-Adam, in which the hero is Edison. And Edison creates a robot of a perfect woman for a friend of his who's so depressed with real women that he's considering suicide. And he says, I'll make you the perfect woman. Now, what's very interesting is this was written before Edison had made the cinema, you know, invented the motion picture. But it predicted that he would do it because it would be how he would bring this robot to life. So there's a, you know, there had been this interest in artificial life. The thing I find most fascinating in Metropolis is, of course, you've got this wonderful performance, and it's her first time on film by Bridget Helm, in which she plays Maria, the kind of prophet of love and reconciliation. And she also plays the false Maria, the robot, who is the prophet of anarchy. What I find very interesting is the real Maria is almost sexless. She's the Virgin Mary. She's pure. The robot is sexy as hell. And there's something very weird about that. The idea that machines could be sexy. I don't know that idea had ever been broached before. And in a funny way, it's one of the things that I think makes this film survive is this idea of this, there's this amazing sequence, of course, where to prove that she can be convincing as a real person, the inventor, Rotvang, brings the false Maria, the robot, before a group of men in tuxedos, and she basically does a striptease. You know, it's a sequence that, of course, was reproduced in the film Bodyguard, and which Madonna kind of did and expressed herself. It is the iconic image, as you say, almost as much the image of silent film now, I think, as Chaplin.
And actually there's a HBO series or something with Anthony Hopkins in which...
the current one, The Westworld, which I have to admit I haven't seen, but my son told me about.
But again, it's the same kind of... And to take it beyond that, the Japanese are actually working on these kind of companions for real. And I saw some feminist commentary bemoaning the fact that actually these fake Japanese women make much better women than real women do. So in a sense, that too has...
Well, that kind of Stepford Wives, first I think in the 60s, late 60s or early 70s, that kind of idea. I actually always admonish my students when I teach film history, never use the word first, because people will always find something earlier. So I don't want to say this is the first time, but it is the emblem, it's the enduring emblem. And I don't know, I think there probably were sexy robots or sexy dolls or something like that before this, but this is the moment where that kind of idea that somehow technology and sexuality can come together.
But he shows it. There's always the,
Yes.
I'd rather buy a paper doll that I can call my own.
Yes.
And then those flirty guys will have to flirt with dollies that are real. Well, that'll show them, I mean, it wasn't convincing. Here he actually makes it sexual, the proposition sexually convincing. And that's,
I have to admit, when I see Bridget Helms dance, her kind of what I found reviewers at the time called her coochie dance.
Right.
There are points where I go, wait a minute, that's a human body?
Right.
She rotates her hips in ways that are extraordinary. And it's exactly that kind of idea of, can a machine be sexy?
Yeah.
And I think it does have a lot of feminist, or the critique of it has a feminist implication.
Yeah. And broader implications about our humanity in an age of cloning and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating stuff. There's always lots to find in that film.
For sure. Well, that's the thing. As I say, it's like a candy box.
Yeah.
Yes, it might not hold together, but maybe that's one of its secrets.
Yeah, there'll be bits you don't like, but there'll always be something in there. That's very wisely said. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Oh, thank you.
No, thanks. And for our finale this week, I did think of having a number from Metropolis, the musical. Yes, there is such a thing, and I was there on the first night, a very long first night. For those who think that the disco Metropolis from the 1980s was the nadir that Tom mentioned a couple of moments ago. The songs for the musical were by the guy who had a blockbuster hit with You Light Up My Life. So on second thoughts,